Hey everybody, welcome back to Time to Talk. Today is going to be part 2 of our episode on politeness and frankness. And for backstory, guys, this is the second time we're recording this. Because I had one of those lovely moments in which technology decides to do something messed up, and it was totally not your fault. Mm-hmm. And I was in the middle of editing our episode, and the software we use sends me this little notification that it's having issues writing my changes to the disk, or whatever that means, okay? And it says, just save your work and close out. So I save my work and close out. I open it back up, and it had decided to play the first 2 seconds of the intro on repeat, the entire file. Like when you get a scratch on a CD, that's literally what it did to me. And I didn't really want to spend the time trying to figure out how to fix it, and so we are back in the studio in air quotes because we don't really have a studio, but recording our part 2 of this episode. Yeah. So welcome. I'm Faith.
I'm Grace.
And today, we're hopefully going to have a very riveting conversation to follow up on our last riveting conversation. To begin us, why don't we do a quick summary of part 1? Especially doing a summary of politeness and frankness, and then we can jump into more of our thoughts on the worldviews behind them and solutions.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and kind of describe politeness again. And basically, the essence of politeness was, like we said, it starts with an assumption of original sin, and that people are different and more sensitive to other people and what they say, and we're all kind of going through our own struggles every single day. And so the polite person is really sensitive to where people are. They ask a lot of questions. They don't automatically assume that people are just going to be truthful and open about how they're feeling or what they're thinking or where they are. And they, in everything they do, it's centered around the idea of original sin, and that they themselves are tempted to say things they shouldn't say, do things they shouldn't do. And so politeness in a way is almost also a restraint on on themselves, so that they are not doing those things. And it has a lot more to do with than just etiquette or opening a door for someone. And those things, I think, can be pieces of it because it shows respect to another person at times. But the overarching thing is that a polite person is, in as much as possible, respectful to another person, because they believe that humanity often errs towards being disrespectful and nasty.
Then to summarize, a frank person, you know what I was literally just going to say? Is the definition's pretty straightforward.
Oh my gosh.
That's so bad. But essentially, yes, being a frank person is someone who is direct and open and will share their thoughts and feelings about things, typically without much reserve, if any reserve at all. And this is partially because of a spirit of individualism, and it was especially, frankness came to kind of be the thing during the Romantic period, and especially during America's foundational years as a country, and that sense of individualism and freedom really gave voice to the idea of frankness and people just speaking out freely of their thoughts and their feelings on things, regardless of how it affected the other person. Because the idea with frankness is, if you say something that another person finds offense with, well, then they'll be frank back towards you. They'll reciprocate the frankness and tell you that they are uncomfortable with what you said, or they disagree with what you said, or something like that. It's very much a give and take in a conversation versus a gently stepping around each other in a polite way so that you don't hurt feelings. And for frankness, the video and article that we've been using as a structure for our podcast says that a frank person believes in natural goodness, the idea that inherently humanity, our thoughts and our feelings and our actions all are intended for good purposes, and that we are, generally speaking, good people, and then there's just a few bad apples, pretty much. Speaking of which, I know we touched on this very briefly in part 1, but I thought maybe we could go into a little bit more depth currently about the idea of original sin and natural goodness, because you and I, obviously we talked about how you were more polite, I'm more frank, but we both actually believe in original sin and not natural goodness.
Yes, I know one of the things we mentioned specifically about this, and this gets into the solution, was that neither politeness or frankness were the complete picture, truly, of what humanity is called to act like. And it came from both of them having, while politeness has a more right foundation, I don't think it still doesn't get the whole picture of how it's then acted out or implemented, whereas frankness has the wrong foundation, but there are still elements of it. I mean, it's like literature. There's Homer got some things right in the Iliad, but he got a lot of things wrong too. And there's a lot of pieces like that where I think because we all have some amount of truth, both that we can learn from creation but also written on our hearts, neither of them are completely wrong. But to the original sin point and natural goodness, I guess. So original sin is the belief that, well, I mean, yes, it's the belief that God created the world. It was good. Adam and Eve sinned by eating of the fruit and disobeying God, and then were cast out. And their sin as the first human beings then set the trajectory for the rest of the world, and that they rebelled against God, and so now their children would be naturally born in a state of rebellion against God.
We will all originally be sinners until we hopefully become saved. It's a weird way of saying become saved, but I mean it's true. We'll be saved by Christ.
Saved, yes. Whereas the idea of natural goodness, which would be, like to your point, you brought up romanticism and all of that, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his idea of man as, he rejected all of that idea and just said, no, man is good, and it's the world that then teaches him to be bad. I mean, before that, you had a few people saying that man was kind of like a blank slate, and
like John Locke and tabula rasa.
And so it wasn't like an instant flip-flop between the two, but for Jean-Jacques was one of the very first people who was like, no, man's not even just a blank slate anymore. He actually is naturally good, and the world corrupts him, which is when you get a lot of the primitive ideas of people thought that if you think Henry, where is Walden? Henry David Thoreau. There we go. That took me way too long to get his name.
Okay.
I was going to say Henry Waldo. I was like, that's wrong. No.
Nope.
But if anybody knows
Thoreau
in America particularly, or you've got Ralph Waldo Emerson and kind of that whole stream of poets, you have this idea that, going back to nature, going back to more simplified life was supposed to kind of enable you to kind of recapture that natural goodness of mankind, and it was civilization that was corrupting versus something inside the individual. So,
which is kind of fascinating if you look back at the time of Romanticism and then the revolutions that happened, and you compare American writing to French writing, because in actuality, Romanticism and this idea of frankness were really, really heavy in France and with the French Revolution versus America. I think even to a certain extent, right? We have freedom of speech written into our Constitution, but the idea is you have freedom of speech to the point that how do you say this? You only have freedom of speech to that line in which you would cross and inhibit someone else's freedom of speech. That's a really bad way of saying it.
No, it's the whole thing of, like, liberty is not you get to do whatever you want to do, but you get to do what you should do. Well, there's some quote about it. I
don't know what quote you're trying to say.
Man.
It sounds like a great quote.
It is a really good quote, which is why I'm frustrated, because it was one of those that...
Do you know who says it?
No. I want to say it was Reagan or somebody like that.
Okay.
But I don't know. Somebody's got a great quote about what liberty is. But it's basically that it's the whole idea that you have the freedoms when you live in a civil society. You have freedoms up to a certain point where you would then infringe upon the freedoms of another person. So it's a codified give and take almost of you have these rights, but the instant you step over, because the truth is, you cannot be totally free and have an anarchy, basically, because that doesn't work. And if you can do whatever you want, then you'll do whatever you want, and it won't go well. And so in a society, it's, again, a society predicated on the notion of original sin. It's the understanding that mankind, to a certain extent, has to be limited, but you still do need to acknowledge his inalienable rights, which is what America was founded on, and versus the French Revolution, where it was based on this idea of mankind is originally good, and so therefore you've got liberty and equality, and they actually destroy religion in the process and kind of try and basically overhaul their society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the point I was going to make is when you look at the American Revolution and all of the speeches and writings and how our government was set up, there is still a heavy emphasis on looking after your fellow man and setting up those boundaries between freedom and responsibility or social responsibility, versus France, where it was burned down everything, and it was very much a focus on killing off all of the elite, literally and figuratively, and elevating the French peasant over, and the common man over any sort of authority figure in their country. And I just find that fascinating too, because to a certain extent, right, you have to have a amount of frank people in order to have a revolution. But frank people also have a tendency to burn things.
No, yeah, it's the balance of, you have to have someone who's willing to tell you how it is, but then you also have to have people who can tell you what it should be, and there has to be a working together of those things of, you can't, like I said, there are very few things in this world that are completely black and white and wrong. Those things do exist, and some of them deserve to be burnt down, and some of them deserve to be celebrated. But especially when you're talking about a nation like France that has had years and years and years and centuries of being built up to this point, yes, there were emphatically a lot of things wrong with the French government and what was going on and all of that, but not all of it was, and the solution wasn't to become an anarchy at the moment.
I don't know if that's a quote that you were looking at. It kind of looks a little similar. It's not exactly what you were thinking.
It's actually very similar to what I was thinking.
Well, so this is a quote by Peter Marshall, who I'm not actually sure who that person is. But it's, "May we think of freedom not as the right to do as we please, but as the opportunity to do what is right." And that, I think, is a very American idea. Was a very American idea. I don't know so much anymore.
Yeah, it's similar, because the quote I was thinking of is, it's something along the lines of, liberty is not the freedom to do as we want, but to do as we ought. Basically.
That sounds right. I can't remember who says that, but that sounds right.
I know our professor, Brian Hudson, has said that, something along those lines, a couple of times to me and in classes, but I know it's a quote elsewhere that I've seen at times. But yeah, it's basically what I was getting at was, liberty is a society that's built up like that is meant to help foster it's meant to curb the natural sin and help people along a path of being good.
Well, to a certain extent, if you think about America's founding in originally the intent of coming over here was freedom of religion specifically. Liberty in that context makes a lot of sense, in that it's not a freedom to just do whatever the heck you want. No, it's a freedom to worship however you please.
And believe you ought to.
Yes, so that you would do the right thing and become a better person in your religion, which at that point was Christianity in different denominations.
So that's kind of like a whole historical side tangent. It helps inform kind of where we are today in terms of what we believe about frankness, which can tie a lot into, authenticity of when people say that, or being yourself, versus politeness, which is very much it used to be kind of a thing that politicians did.
Politeness?
Yeah. there was still a bit of decorum in how that worked. That was a little bit more formal than your day-to-day kind of thing. And not to say that there are no polite people at all in existence, but when you think back, especially in the South, and you had a lot of like the finishing schools. I just hit this. And you had a lot of finishing schools, and I mean those existed in the North too, but it used to be a thing that everyone was polite, and then some people were polite, and it kind of was this elitist thing. And nowadays it's almost, if you're polite, you're fake, because you're not the opposite, which would be authentic and frank and just open and honest and vulnerable, is how a lot of people think about frankness nowadays.
And I think there's always pockets of politeness versus frankness, too, because if you think about the business world, I think there's still a lot of, it's called business etiquette now, but the idea is politeness, which makes sense when you're dealing with people in business situations, but then you do have frankness that's celebrated in people's personal lives more so, and I think the words we used have just to describe parts of them have changed. What do you mean?
Well, I don't think people think of frankness so much as they think of authenticity now.
Yeah.
And I don't think people think of politeness so much as like an ethical, or not an ethical thing, because that's different. It's not moral or ethical, but as a code of conduct kind of thing.
Yeah.
So let's put it this way. I almost think that frankness, under the guise of authenticity, has become a lot more of an identity thing, of like, you are authentic, versus politeness, which has almost become an external thing as a code of conduct that you sometimes have to follow because you live in a society and can't be
an anarchist?
Yeah, basically. You can't do and say whatever you want that would be purely authentic to you because other people exist.
That's actually a very true statement. That one is an identity versus one a behavior.
Yeah, and obviously that's a sweeping generalization that I'm specifically talking about America at this point because that's where we live, and that's what I know the most about. So don't come at me if you're like, well, that's not true. Because yes, I realize that, again, it's a generalization of trends that I'm seeing and have been paying attention to just because I like that kind of stuff. So if you don't fall into that, good for you. Okay?
Yeah, and I think, again, it's part of how those things have been portrayed, and especially living in the Midwest, I think you just tend to be more of a frank person because it's more of that homestead type of environment that you live in.
Yeah, here's where my bias is going to come out. Because I live in the Midwest, and I've grown up in the Midwest, and I love it here. But I honestly think the Midwest is one of the areas in which we have the best blending of frankness and politeness. For a lot of different reasons. Again, not shaming anyone who lives on the coast or lives in the South.
I'm sending you all the shame.
Oh my gosh. No, I'm not. The truth is, like, we could go all day long about why people in New York act the way they do, or people in the South, especially the deep South as people call it, act the way they do. It's a lot of it is really a very much cultural thing, and in the Midwest, our culture just lends itself to kind of a more mellow nature in that, people, to your point, a lot of people grew up on farms or knew people on farms, and it was a big farming agricultural industry, but even now that we're, not everyone grows up like that. We didn't grow up like that. It's still a big mood of the Midwest is just this, down to earth, hometown, homegrown kind of person. But there still is an element of being polite and respecting your elders and respecting people in authority and this layer of etiquette,
and being friendly to strangers.
Yeah, and being welcoming and hospitable. Yeah, so it's a blend that obviously isn't perfect all the time, but I do think in the Midwest it's a very large piece of how our culture functions here. Our little pocket culture.
And you bring up a good point too of this politeness and frankness definitely fall more on the nurture versus nature side of that whole debate, there is a degree of, introvert versus extrovert, or thinker versus feeler, depending on whatever type of personality assessment you go with, that plays into frankness and politeness. And we talked about this a little bit too, just between you and I, that I am much more of an analytical thinker person. So that sounded very odd the way I said that. But because I'm less focused on the relationships, I tend to just speak my mind more freely because I'm not as concerned about what other people are thinking, versus you, who's very hyper aware of the relationships and the interactions going on around you and how people are feeling. You lean towards more politeness because you can see how much damage or good that, a word can cause somebody, which is a great thing. So nature plays not a tiny bit. I mean, it plays into it a little bit, but I definitely think that the nurture part of it is where the heavy emphasis comes in and what your culture believes in terms of what your behavior should look like, where specifically the subcultures that you live in, and those types of things. And to a certain extent, I think politeness and frankness, you could look at them as the problem, but it's what we've said in past episodes too, of you just need to be aware of why you act the way that you act, and does it support what you believe? And do you need to change the way you act based on how you believe? Or are you just going to keep living like a hypocrite?
No, I think we can agree that what man is born with is original sin, and the bent towards doing evil. Like, that is, without a doubt, what our nature, and it's something we struggle with for the rest of our lives in this world and in this earth. But this is why I kind of brought up the issue of a frankness becoming an authenticity and an identity thing versus an external thing. And I'm pretty sure we got into it we got into it in our first part when we were talking about masks and stuff, and how they become almost shields versus like a part of you, if that makes sense. And so that's where it gets really difficult when you start talking about nurture and what those things end up becoming. And it looks different for a 5-year-old than the 55-year-old, and sometimes people can navigate those waters, and sometimes people have a really difficult time doing that. But I think, obviously, from your and I's perspective, and the biblical perspective, is mankind is born originally sinful and bent towards evil. And so there is a curbing of our fleshly desires that needs to happen without then completely removing those foundational truths.
So this is where we start getting into more of the solution, in terms of, we talked about in the article and the video, it was pushing for politeness to start at least being more observed and taken into account in interactions. And for us, I think when you're talking about the biblical perspective, it brings to mind several scriptures, such as the Proverbs, right, where it says a gentle answer turns away wrath,
but a harsh word stirs up anger.
Or sweet words are like a honeycomb to the soul, or those types of proverbs in which it's heavily encouraged to speak gently to someone and speak politely to someone, because it's better for the relationship, it's better for the actual conversation.
And even when Proverbs is talking about rebuking someone, it mentions that a wise person will take the rebuke pretty much the first time you say it, but don't rebuke a fool in his folly, because he won't listen to you. And so even that gets into the piece of frankness versus politeness and how you go about confronting people.
Yeah, but you can't just take those Proverbs alone. There are some other scriptures too that we've talked about that play into this, such as Paul in Ephesians, when he's talking about Christians and how Christ has saved them, not so that they can go back into their sin, but now here's what they need to do as an outpouring of the faith that they have in the salvation that they have. And one of those things is learning how to speak the truth in love, which is for me, it's always kind of been, oh, yeah, that kind of makes sense. But it's one of those things that you always think, how again? Come again?
What does
do I
that
do
actually look like?
How do you speak the truth in love? What does that mean? And that's one of the verses. The other one that I always think of too is when Jesus is telling the disciples that they need to be as wise as serpents and as gentle as doves. Mm-hmm. And it's that dichotomy that you just think, okay, this kind of makes sense, but it also doesn't make sense. And what does it mean? And can you please give me the politeness and frankness for dummies? Because I don't understand what's going on.
No, and then you have the passage in, I think it's First Peter, basically where it's actually I think it's Second Peter, where he's talking about having defense for your faith, but like he mentions, but he's talking about having defense for your faith and a reason for the faith the hope that's in you, but you're to do it in a way that's like seasoned with salt, but it's gracious, and you're like, what does that mean?
No, come on, Peter. Why I just want to bite their head off? It's funny that Peter writes that because he did bite people's heads off. So I guess
he cut a dude's ears off.
So I guess he kind of finally learned from his lesson.
Yes. I mean, that whole interchange is probably like an excellent example of the Christian response to that kind of violence and aggression versus the world's, our man's natural response.
So basically what we're saying is the answer is not what you want to hear, but it's what you need to hear, which is there needs to be some balance in your life.
Yes.
There's no simple do it this way or don't do it this way for these kind of things. I think it's just important to remember that frankness and politeness, they are behaviors, and your behaviors need to match your beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Frankness is not who you are. Politeness is not who you are. They're what you do.
Yeah. So you don't have to feel guilty, and I know I had talked about this in the first episode, that I, to a certain extent, feel guilty if I'm not frank with someone, and that's something that I need to learn to be okay with, because the reality is yes, you should feel guilty if you treated someone wrongly, and you should apologize in that whole situation. But you shouldn't necessarily feel guilty for your action as, how do I say this? Without saying that you shouldn't feel guilty for how you treat someone.
I think it goes back to, we had touched on it briefly, just this idea of, because they are actions you do and other people only see the actions you do. I know my tendency when I see other people doing something is to kind of associate it with who they are. So if I see someone being really frank and open with people, I'll just say, oh, they must be like that a lot. And so when they're not as much like that as they normally are, it might lead me to believe, hey, is something going on? Is something wrong with them? Are they actually trying to hide something? Sometimes it can shift to the worst possible thought too. But it is a difficult balance of, people can't see your motivations, they only see your actions. But also, politeness and frankness are still actions. And there's different motivations that you can have the same for each of them. Like, you can respond frankly to someone because you love them and are trying to speak the truth and love to them. You can also respond politely to someone because, again, you're trying to be frank, because you're trying to speak the truth and love to them.
Yeah.
I don't know if that gets at what you were saying.
I think what I was just trying to say is, as long as you're aware of why you're doing what you're doing, you don't need to feel guilty if it ends up coming out the wrong way, or ends up not having the reaction that you intended for it to have.
With obvious caveats.
Or, okay, so basically, I can give an example to clear this up, which is, I like to be frank, but let's say I'm in a situation in which I'm meeting someone new for the first time, and they happen to have a hairstyle that I don't like. Well, it would be very rude and wrong of me to say, hey, my name is Faith. Also, your hairstyle is awful, and I really think that you need to get a different cut or something. That would be really rude. It would also be a star for frankness, because you're supposed to say exactly what you think and feel.
Mm-hmm.
But in that situation, I could not say that and then get angry at myself for not being frank and feel guilty for not being frank because the fact that frankness has become my reigning ideology in code of conduct. Or I can accept the fact that different times call for different sets of behaviors, and so at some points I need to be polite, and at some points I need to be frank, and the only thing that I need to feel guilty about is whether or not I actually did the right or wrong thing.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, and I was just going to say, the way you first said it made it sound like as long as you knew why you were saying something, you didn't need to feel guilty for the consequences of it. I was like, that is not what you mean.
That's why I was concerned about it at first, that it kind of sounded like I was excusing people's sin because of good intentions.
No.
I'm like, no, that's not where I was going.
The ends don't justify the means, and the intentions don't justify the actions, people. Sorry.
That's very good. We should put that on our... Is that original to you?
No. I mean, yes, actually. The ends don't justify the means. Like, me putting them together might be is original that I haven't heard before, but those two things do exist separately. It felt very poetic. Thank you.
Applause.
Thank you. Are you being polite right now and just, like, coaxing my...
No, I'm just...
I don't know if that's...
I'm appreciating that as a podcast producer, that you just gave a very good soundbite.
All right. There you go. It's excellent.
Yeah.
Good on me. Gives myself a pat on the back.
Wow.
I'm joking. No. But yes, it was well said.
Yeah. So, the other thing that I just thought, which is related, but also not related for those listening. Well, the first time we recorded this, somehow we brought up Larry and Bob. And I'm so disappointed that we lost that episode, because the thing was, we were going to send up a poll on Instagram for people to vote
of
which one of us was more like Larry and which one of us is more like Bob, because...
Why did we bring...
Well, we brought it up, one, because I started singing the theme song.
So we have learned applies to our lives today. God has a lot to say in his book. Yes.
You see, we know that God's word is for everyone. Now that our song is done, let's take a look.
With QWERTY.
I don't know why we have that memorized.
Guys, we watched so many VeggieTales. No shame.
Awesome. It was so great. One of the best
Winnie
kid shows ever. Yes. Anyway, so I don't remember the context in which I brought up the song. But we then started talking about Larry and Bob and who would be whom. And I said I would be Larry, and you said you would be Larry. And then we had this massive conflict, in air quotes because we actually didn't really, about who was more like the cucumber and who was more like the tomato.
Mm-hmm. That is literally the conversation we had. Yep.
Yes.
Who's more like a cucumber,
there are
more
serious
like a
conversations that go on over here.
Exactly.
We argue over who would be which vegetable in a kids' TV show.
Yep.
Very important stuff.
Crucial.
Yeah, you need to know this for your
Life-changing.
self-worth.
It changes your identity.
Oh my goodness. Anyway, so I know we don't have the correct context anymore, but I still want to do that poll on Instagram.
She's bringing it up just so that we can have this poll.
Yes, because otherwise it would have been lost in the abyss, and that makes me so sad. VeggieTales does not deserve to be thrown in the garbage.
Sad, yes.
Yeah, I can't talk. Garbage can.
So, yep, we're going to do the poll some point in time this week. Y'all can tell us whether you think you are more a Larry or a Bob.
No. They're telling us.
Oh.
They don't know.
Oh.
This is not for them to figure out who they are. This is for them to figure out who we are. Is Grace Larry or Bob? And then am I Larry or Bob? And we'll tally up the votes, and the people will have spoken.
So the people get to decide whether I'm Larry or Bob.
Yes.
Wow. You guys have a lot of power. Don't choose wrong. Don't choose incorrectly. Face like, I have faith in them.
I don't know if they could choose incorrectly. They would just...
Oh, you already know who the answer is. What the answers are.
No, I don't.
Oh.
No, I'm just saying I don't know if they could choose correctly or incorrectly because it's their opinion versus your opinion.
All right, so based on your opinions, they'll decide whether one of us is...
And then you just have to go with it.
Okay.
And those will be our next Halloween questions.
Oh my gosh, no.
There are high stakes writing on this. Shh. Honestly, I would never dress up at them because you remember that one time that we went to that bookstore when we were really little and they did the VeggieTales show?
Yep, and people were dressed up like VeggieTales and they were entirely terrifying.
It was traumatizing.
Yep.
It was awful. We have pictures of it, and Paige just absolutely loved them and was treating them like actual celebrities and could not wait to get near them and get pictures with them. And Grace and I are probably bawling our eyes out at some point and trying to run away.
Honestly, though,
I hate mascots or anything like that. I don't. There's just something about them that I never appreciate. I think it's cool what people do in them, considering the fact that they're so
True.
big and bulky and
True.
hot.
And
I like how we both thought about them at the same time. They're just hot.
yep.
So I think it's cool what people do in them, but they're also kind of,
Mm-hmm.
why do we have these things?
Yeah.
Stupid. So to go back to our actual topic for this episode, I know one of the other things we mentioned in the Lost Forever episode was C.S. Lewis's Till We Have Faces. Specifically in regards to what we mentioned at the very end of part 1, which was wearing masks and how these things become masks. Because I think a lot of it we've hopped around it and mentioned at several points that frankness and politeness aren't part of your identity, but things that you do, and some, like, our culture kind of makes frankness an authenticity thing, which is part of who you are, versus politeness is a code of conduct. And there's all of these, there's gray waters, but I think we both would agree that politeness and frankness they are always what you do, not who you are. And yet we do have a tendency to make what we do a mask, and it's kind of easier to just keep plodding along in that same track that you've worn over time and eventually say this is just who you are and what you do, and the real you is hidden from other people. That sounds like really new agey.
That's what I was about to say.
No,
The real you is hidden from the sight of
right?
others.
But to a certain extent, it's true in that you adopt a persona of being a polite person or a frank person because that's easier and that's what people have expected you to become, versus a person who is well-rounded and can approach situations with careful thought when needed to understand whether or not a gracious word of just affirmation is needed or a gracious word of confrontation and rebuke is needed.
Were you actually going to bring up the Till We Have Faces
I was kind of waiting for you to bring up that story.
Oh, I butchered it so much.
And I'm pretty
Basically-
sure her name is Orwell, but I probably just butchered her that pronunciation too.
Uriel. I don't know.
I have no idea.
It's a odd spelling, and I never knew how to say it. And then I heard it pronounced once, and I forgot how to say it. But Till We Have Faces is a retelling of... Now Paige is going to get mad at us again because we butchered this the first time we brought this up, and we had
Persephone
the wrong...
and Hades.
Yes, okay. Persephone and Hades. Thank you,
And
Paige.
if she gets mad at me again, then I'm
Google
really
it.
stupid and forgot all of my myths.
No, it's Persephone, Diana, and Hades.
Hang on, I'm Googling.
Diana. Her mom's name starts with a D.
Alright. To
Handy dandy Google.
have faces.
I always get it confused because he renames the characters. Because it's Mars until we have faces and not Hades.
I know.
No luck. You should also look up the pronunciation of her name while you're at it.
Alright, let me see if I can get that.
Do 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 do.
Alright, this is not helpful.
Do. So, listeners, how was your weekend?
Okay, here we go. We did get this wrong again. Till We Have Faces, the myth retold, is a retelling of Cupid and Psyche based on its telling in a chapter of the Golden Ass of Apuleius. There we go.
Wow, we are so
We
wrong.
really did get it wrong.
That's okay. I think I always get them confused because that's the myth that I know that someone's kidnapped. But you're right. It's not. Okay. So, Cupid and Psyche. That makes so much more sense.
Look, somebody... Okay, how do you pronounce... Wait,
Is it not going to play?
an error occurred.
They don't know how to say her name.
How to pronounce... Orual or Orual?
Oral.
O like an orange, not like own. Ru as like rue, or ol like bull. So Orual or Orul.
Oral. The more you say it, the weirder it sounds. Oral.
Yeah, I don't know.
You're trying to listen to someone read the book. You know what's funny? Is oral sounds like Oriole, like the bird.
Is that right? Is that a bird?
Yes.
An oriole
You're right.
is a bird.
It's also like a team, some sports team.
The Orioles.
Or at least they have that as
Or
their
you have
mascot.
Oreos and.
Well, yes, so
That's
think
what we'll call her.
Oreos. I think Oreos.
Oreos.
I'm just gonna
Orule.
keep Orioles.
I think it's Orule.
Orule.
Orule. Okay. Anyway, there. Cupid and Psyche.
Okay. Paige, don't come at us.
Wow. After that very, very long intro to this, I shall finally tell you. So, Till We Have Faces is a retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche. And it is from the perspective of Oriole. She is the queen of this kingdom somewhere.
Greek
we don't
land,
really know.
someplace.
Yeah, some Greek.
Actually, correction.
Kingdom.
Fox, her tutor, comes from
Yeah,
Greek
it's not
land.
Greek. It's
She's
not
in
Greek.
some
She's-
different place where they worship a god called Ungit,
Yes.
a goddess.
And Ungit demands a yearly sacrifice of a single female from the village.
You could just say a virgin. That's what she requires.
Oh, is that?
Uh-huh.
Okay, a virgin. I didn't realize. For some reason, I just thought it was a
No.
female.
I mean, like,
for some
think
reason, but I
as
guess
far
that
back
makes
as,
the
like,
sense.
ancient Greek temples.
So, this is just going to be an example of, let's see how much Faith can butcher one of her favorite books of all time.
Apparently.
Okay, so, Ungit requires a virgin sacrifice every year, and during this year that the book takes place, it happens to be Oriole's youngest sister, and this is the sister that she loves the most, and she's required to be the sacrifice. Without many spoilers, there's a situation that happens with the sacrifice, and Oriole ends up blaming herself for that situation and feels super guilty about it. And then her father ends up dying, and she becomes queen, and she kind of has to live her whole reign with this guilt, which she tries to go and find her little sister again, and she's always angry with the gods about what happened, and she's just a very bitter person. And in the book, C.S. Lewis her character has some disfigurement, and she's just not pretty at all, so she actually wears a mask when she is older, and especially as a queen, she just wears a mask.
She wears
Everywhere.
a veil, and because, as time goes on, nobody has seen her face, it builds up all these myths of, like, oh my gosh, she must be so gorgeous that basically people can't look upon her. Otherwise, they would not quite die, but they kind of would, because she's so gorgeous and she's mysterious, and it's this whole heightened thing that because she wears a veil, to her it has these unintended consequences that builds her up as this amazing, beautiful, to die for queen.
Yeah, and that's kind of what other people think, but for her personally, she wears the veil, one, to actually hide her ugliness, on her physical ugliness, but she also does it as a means of protection too, because when she lost her sister and lost the one thing in life that was dear to her, she kind of shut herself off from everybody around her, and a veil was a very easy way of doing it. Right? That no one feels comfortable now approaching her to talk with her, and she's set up that air of mystery that she is more knowledgeable than the rest of them, or has some sort of higher authority, which, I mean, she actually does because she's the queen. But it just provides that barrier that allows her to exist in her own bubble. So she goes throughout life just being very angry at people, at the gods. And at the end of the book, she actually has this dream sequence when she's sick. And she gets to go to the gods and meet the gods and present this entire case that she's written up against them about how they have maligned her family and how they are guilty for what has occurred. And she starts reading this to the gods and realizes that it's all just a bunch of nonsense.
And she's saying the same thing over and over again, which is basically, it's your fault, like a 5-year-old.
Pointing at their kid.
It's their fault. It's their fault.
Yeah. And why is this the second time we've recorded this and I didn't grab the book? Oh, I'm so mad because I'm going to butcher the quote again. But there's this fantastic line that Lewis writes that we can't face the gods until we have faces. Is that the line? this isn't the next time that we sing. How many times can we sing Jeopardy in this episode? I'll just talk about my coffee that I'm currently enjoying. It's some crappy Starbucks roast that I don't even know how to make. But it's coffee.
I'm gonna start reading this. Let me tell you.
Okay.
See if this is the one you're thinking of. When the time comes to you at which you will be forced at last to utter the speech which has lain at the center of your soul for years, would you have all that time, idiot-like, been saying over and over, "You'll not talk about the joy of words"? I saw well why the gods do not speak to us openly, nor let us answer. Till that word can be dug out of us, why should they hear the babble that we think we mean? How can they meet us face to face till we have faces?
Yeah, it's a good thing that you read that, because I really did butcher that. But I think essentially what Lewis is saying there, and I always go back and forth on this when I read it, but it's the idea that until we have acknowledged who we are, right? And that's all things from us as being the lowliest of sinners to now being redeemed in Christ. Until we have acknowledged who we are, we can't actually, in this situation, it's you can't engage with the gods, but there's just a general principle of, I don't know what I'm trying to say. I'm doing a terrible job of butchering this.
I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention because I've been reading
I was
quotes.
trying to summarize the quote and what Lewis is talking about, because in this context, it's until you know yourself, you can't talk to the gods.
Well, it goes back, and like we mentioned, it goes back to what Paul says of, now we see in a glass dimly, but one day we'll see him face to face in all of his glory, talking about Christ. It's the same principle of, again, mankind in... The story of Oriol and Psyche is one of perverted love. And that perverted love towards her sister, I was kind of reading this because I wanted to see it, but she, at some point she talks about, like, do I hate him? Indeed, I believe so. A love like that can grow to be 9/10 hatred and still call itself love. And she says things like that a lot of times, and she never admits that to herself about her sister. But truly, Oriol's love for her sister becomes a perversion that then affects her entire world. And just like she has masked herself against the world, she has masked inside against the truths as well. And I think that's what we were kind of getting at with politeness and frankness, is that they can be masks as an external thing that shields us from other people and them seeing the truth about us. And so it's not exactly to the extent of we're building up a giant mystery about us like Oriol was with her veil, but we are shielding them from knowing our vulnerabilities and our struggles,
right,
and our weaknesses at points, or maybe all they know is our weaknesses versus the things that we have strengths in. But they can, over time, if like Oriol wore this thing her entire life from the moment Psyche was taken and she became queen, basically. And if it's something that is it's so ingrained in you to do, it becomes a mask. Like, you have to function this way because it's the only way you know how. And everybody knows that if generally speaking, when there are bad habits and there are good habits, and if you have a consistent way that it could be 20% of the time right, but 80% of the time the wrong way to function, it is not going to end well. And so when you mask things with politeness or frankness or anything else, it can, in the short term, be something to protect you, but in the long term, protections do need to be broken down. And you can't always have a brick wall or, a stone wall or even a hedge built up around.
Hedge of protection.
Right. You can't always have that up. And so I think that's what we were kind of driving at, was this whole idea of we live in a world which is very gray. There are black and whites, but it's overwhelmingly gray.
I think, well, I have another thing there's the different story that puts into perspective Till We Have Faces for me. It makes it a lot more sense, and then leads to a similar point, but a little bit different than what you're saying, which is the story of Jacob in Scripture, and specifically when he's wrestling with God. Jacob's name means
liar.
Heel grabber, literally, but basically
Usurper.
Liar, cheater, usurper, and that's his story for much of his life. Is he cheats his brother out of his birthright, and then he cheats Laban out of Laban's wealth, and he lives so much of his life doing duplicitous things.
Well, and he's stuck in this world in which, because he's duplicitous, then Laban is duplicitous to him.
Yeah, and he
reaps
good. His own sin through other people. And when he's traveling back to his homeland, he hears that Esau and all of Esau's peoples and everything are coming out to meet him, and probably Jacob thinks they're going to kill Jacob's entire family. And Jacob tries to go, and this what I think is really
circuitous, splits people up.
And he splits people up to try to keep them safe, and he also sends this massive gift forward to try to bribe Esau's favor into letting Jacob live, blah, blah, blah. Okay? And at the end of it, Jacob ends up being by himself in this field, and there's this God somehow, in some way, shape, or form, there's this wrestling match that takes place between him and Jacob, and there's a moment where Jacob's hip is put out of socket, but he keeps wrestling, and he's hanging on to this other man, trying to wrestle him, and they're just going nowhere at this point. And so is he called a man of God in the Scripture, or just God? Should I just say God?
Well, I think it's like the angel of God, which, if again, that's a whole complicated topic about angels and God. And basically, it's God, with the understanding that God is not only that.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway,
God is not that.
Anyway,
it's
God,
complicated.
God kind of, in my very poor paraphrasing of this, God just kind of tells Jacob, "Hey,
let go,
dude. We need to cut this out. We're going nowhere. I can't overcome you, and you can't overcome me. We are at a stalemate." And Jacob, realizing that, and also realizing that if he lets go, there's kind of not many good ways that this situation could go, because...
Well, okay, can I...
Yes.
Back up to what you just said of, like, God can't overcome him?
No, don't explain it. That's...
All right.
I'm just really doing a poor paraphrasing of Scripture, okay? I don't really want to go into the... Whatever, if you have questions about that, we can talk about it later. But anyway, so Jacob kind of realizing that there is nothing... There's no benefit from him leaving this situation... Right? He doesn't like the stalemate. So he tells God, "No, I'm not letting go until you bless me." And God counters with, "I can't bless you unless you tell me your name." And Jacob realizes at that moment that he's been living his entire life under this lie that he is someone else, when his actual identity and name is cheater and liar. In that moment, he has to admit...
He has to confess who he is.
Yeah, he has to confess who he is and how he has lived his life, and the fact that he actually truly does need God, and he needs salvation and forgiveness. So anyway, that's the story that I'm always reminded of in Till We Have Faces, and that's what I was trying to say is, you have to, in order to be able to stand upon anything, right, or even have some sort of... In this sense, right, God gives Jacob a new identity. Mm-hmm. In order to have any type of new life, you have to admit who you are, and have a face, put a face and a name to what that was, in order to move forward.
And it's very much what Orwell says of essentially until that word is pulled from you. And the way she says it is basically like, I almost had no power to... All of what I said was babble. It was dust in the wind, and it was meaningless, and it had to be pulled from me, the word that was truly what was the complaint and who I was. And for her, it goes back to that perverted love and everything she's dealt with, and it's until that moment happens, and you have now, for her, been unveiled, and the true face has been put on, and who you really are. there is no getting anywhere. And I guess kind of to go all the way back to what we're talking about, politeness is frankness is
that those can become the words, the identities that you hang yourself on, and you will not let go of them. And
some people, there are just not crosses that you want to die on. There are some that you should,
okay,
but there are some that you should not. And continue with what you were saying.
Yeah, and if it's detrimental to your life and your relationships, you should probably consider stopping that, right? Which is what we're talking about with frankness and politeness, that they do not have to be the hills upon which you die. They don't. And there needs to be that separation between identifying yourself as someone who is polite and frank and living as someone who is frank or polite because of the fact that you have certain beliefs that inform those types of behaviors.
Yep.
And that was a really, really long, roundabout way of explaining both of those stories get to a very simple point.
We said some things better than we did the first time. We said some things worse than we did the first time. That's kind of how it goes.
Yep. I think we kind of made our point, which is, again...
made our point. I think we made our point.
This seems to be the theme in most of our episodes currently in this season, that mindlessness is just not something that you should
mindlessness is not good, but also the answer to everything is turning to Jesus Christ and his salvation.
Yeah.
And redemption. That's honestly the preschool answer, the Sunday's preschool answer of Jesus is always right with explanation and expounding upon that answer. But yes, and again, like it seems like we're taking a drastic leap from like politeness and frankness to like your soul hangs in the balance. But honestly, it's actually not that big of it, because you could replace anything, politeness and frankness, with anything, whether it's how you act or it's something you struggle with. But and the truth remains of that, a lot of the things that we do of our own strength and just have built up over time are often masks and walls that need torn down, and it's only through the grace of God that we can come to that self-realization, and to the realization of who we are, and then the next step of confessing that.
Yeah.
And then repenting of it and becoming restored and renewed and forgiven into a new creation of now in this time you're still going to struggle with the original sin and the sinfulness of the world, but you, not of your own strength but of Christ's strength in you, can become a new creation who can speak the truth in love and have that blending of politeness and frankness that is appropriate.
And as much as it sounds very... Is route the word that I'm looking for?
Well, you'll have to finish this. Where are you going with it?
Well, I was going to say, as much as it sounds route that we keep saying this thing, or cliche, is that...
You used the word correctly. I have no idea if you pronounced it the right way. No idea.
Basically what it means, as much as it sounds like we're saying the same thing over and over again, and it's kind of cliche at this point, I do think it's important that, we live in a culture that there is such a distance between your behavior and the consequences for your behavior.
And that's not really a helpful, dictionary way of saying it.
No, it's not. But
to put to route. I think that's how you say it.
Okay. Route.
Just so she's proved right.
Route. Boom. Said it correctly. Validated for how many other words that I pronounce incorrectly. My point being, in modern day society, and this is not just an American problem, but it's part of an issue that we have with technology and social media and everything, is there's such a separation between how you act and the consequences for how you act. And that's why I think it's very important that don't just like the post on Facebook because it's a friend or something. Actually consider how your actions are informing your beliefs, or your beliefs are informing your actions, is what we're trying to encourage you as our listeners to do, and telling each other to do, of just not being another cog in the machine of modern day society, but really being intentional with how we live our lives, how we spend our time, and obviously we have a ton of growth to do in those. And favorite TV shows don't necessarily help being intentional with how you spend your time, but
Not speaking from personal experience.
no, not at all.
Hey, we all have our own struggles.
Yes. But it's right, it's acknowledging those struggles, acknowledging what you believe in, trying to marry those,
Not excusing
those
it.
two actions and beliefs together as much as possible, and knowing that there will always be room for growth, which is great because life would be boring if you didn't have a challenge.
It would. As much as we want the easy, non-confrontational, just kind of glides through.
As fun as Mary Poppins is with snapping and cleaning a room in 2 seconds, life would be really boring if that were the case.
Yeah, and the amount of virtues that you can build by just going through the motions of cleaning a bedroom are a lot.
Yeah. But anyway, that's pretty much all we have time for today. We could keep talking and rambling about things, but we won't bore you guys.
We're really good at that, as you all know, is the whole rambling thing.
Yeah. So just keep out for our poll on Larry and Bob, and let us know who you think is whom. Our next episode is probably going to be some sort of Christmas special, so that shall be very fun to record.
It's Christmas time, pretty baby. Sorry. I don't know why I just got that song in my head. There are like so many Christmas songs, and that's the one I came up with.
But yeah, go follow us over on Instagram at Time to Talk, because we'll be posting a lot of holiday-themed kind of stuff with the podcast, fun things. We really value those guys who interact with us over there. It's really fun to hear your favorite Christmas music or, your favorite recipes or podcasts. We're always open to suggestions for things. And I think that's about all I have on that side. Obviously, we would appreciate if you subscribe to the podcast and leave us
a rating and review.
Preferably a very high one.
Yeah, we'll delete it if it's not a high one. I'm joking.
We
don't do that kind of stuff.
To be frank with you guys, we don't.
You can be frank with us in your rating and review.
Yeah, but we don't handle criticism very well, so we're going to kick it out the window. I'm kidding. But, yeah, so we would appreciate that. But until next time.
Cue the cool music.